Ready? Are we streaming? We're live. I'm Will Smith, and I'm with Hendrik de Pachter again. Welcome to In Victoria's Garden, and we're going to be talking once again about we're all going to live, we're all going to die, and just try to explore that topic a little bit, see what's going on this planet as we continue to explore this show, how we're going to do this show, and what the whole scene is really about on this planet right now. So thanks for tuning in. Here's Hendrik.
Good to be with you again, Will. Thank you very much for inviting me again. I'm not sure how I qualified after our first time together, but here I am.
Intro.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to make a little sign that says, with Will Smith and Hendrik de Pachter. So you just let it run, and then you can cut back to me.
Make your voices on.
Oh yeah, it is. So cut. Today we're going to talk about we're all going to live, we're all going to die again. This is if you saw our first show with Hendrik, he puts things on his Facebook page about that, and some of the things that are happening on this planet are pretty dire. And I must say that I've spent probably the 50 years of my life worrying about that sort of thing, and I'm much more sanguine now about what's going on, simply because I think that consciousness is primary. And so I think a lot of this stuff that's going on this planet is just to get us to wake up and see what's going on and learn that we have further capabilities. We have the capability of living on this planet without destroying it. So anyway, we'll just start off talking about that. We are all basically aware that our lifestyle is destructive to the planet, and at first, when our consciousness of what's going on the planet was more limited, say a few hundred years ago. I mean, it's only been 500 years since it's generally been known that the Earth is round, right? And some people still don't. Some people still haven't quite gotten that into their consciousness. So
Every time I fall, I'm convinced the Earth is flat.
So at any rate. But now that I can remember seeing clips and talking to my grandmother, who is a fan of Teddy Roosevelt, and she was showing me things about all these animals that he killed in Africa, and it was like, he killed thousands of animals. He'd go on a hunting trip and kill hundreds and hundreds of animals, and he and his son, I think, had a stack of dead animals, and now one dentist goes over there and shoots one animal, and that's the end of it's all over Facebook and everything else. So our consciousness is changing very rapidly, whether we're cognizant of it or not.
Well, I might argue that from the point of view of the lions and the elephants, our consciousness hasn't changed fast enough in that regard. We may be more sensitive about a dentist buying the right to kill a trapped lion, but this has been going on for 100 years, and we ought to be sensitive about any lion and any elephant being killed, because there's so few of them that remain in this realm dominated by humans.
Well, I agree with that. Of course, I can't disagree with that. It's self-evident, but the thing is that we haven't had the means of knowing about, that there are a limited number of elephants. It was just something over there, that's over there, and there are plenty of elephants. I mean, we hadn't even made it to the source of the Nile until around mid-19th century, right? So, I mean, we've really made this huge amount of progress, but the main thing for me is that it's changing our consciousness without us even being aware of it.
I don't know if it's in some ways an archaic revival, the term that Terence McKenna used, where as we continue to evolve intellectually and spiritually, we inevitably return to a sense of connectedness with the all. And that was the way our ancestors lived and celebrated life. And now we have a growing awareness after a tremendous period of being alienated from our connection to the natural world, that we need to be reconnected in order to bring it all together. And that's why killing 100 elephants 100 years ago wasn't a big deal, but today killing one is, as we return to an awareness of our connectedness to the all.
Right, and that is another. Well, you know, if you visit or read about indigenous tribes, shamanic-based cultures, I think that some of that was experiential. In other words, the connectedness, the feeling of connectedness was experiential, and somehow we've disconnected with that, and now we're coming back to it. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that we can't at least start by saying, gee, we really need to be connected. How do we do that? And then that sort of folds into this revival, the archaic revival. Right, that's the
Back to the Future, as it were.
Right. So anyway, the thing that I wanted to point out was there's always this lag when we discover something, when one or a certain number of people discover something, and then for it to get integrated into our culture. And I think that the point that I want to make about that is that we've known for a while now that the competition, that survival of the fittest really doesn't, if it's only the fittest that survives, then nobody survives eventually, because everything's gone. So I think I'd like to talk about this Nash equilibrium, which is something that was formally recognized probably around 50 years ago, maybe even a little less than that. And that is not in our culture yet. Our culture is still competition, survival of the fittest. Admittedly, it is changing, but it takes a while for that to happen before it hits enough at critical mass before we hit the tipping point. So let's just watch that. This is an excerpt from a movie called "It's a Beautiful Mind," and it's about a mathematician named Nash.
The Russell Crowe.
Russell Crowe, right. So
I enjoyed watching that.
Deep breaths. Nash, you might want to stop shuffling your papers for 5 seconds.
I will not buy you gentlemen beer.
Oh, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Oh. Does anyone else feel she should be moving in slow motion?
Will she want a large wedding, you think?
Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn?
Have you remembered nothing? Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, the father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good.
Exactly.
Every man for himself, gentlemen.
And those who strike out are stuck with their friends.
I'm not gonna strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make her drink.
I don't think he said that.
All right, nobody move. She's looking over here. Right, she's looking at Nash.
Oh, God. All right, he may have the upper hand now, but wait until he opens his mouth. Remember the last time?
Oh, yes, that was one of the history books.
Adam Smith needs revision.
What are you talking about?
If we all go for the blonde, we block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way, and we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid. Adam Smith said, the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, that's right? Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay? Because the best result would come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group.
Ash, this is some way for you to get the blonde on your own. You can go to hell.
Governing dynamics, gentlemen. Governing dynamics. Adam Smith. What's wrong?
Yep, there we go. Careful, careful.
Thank you.
You do realize this flies in the face of 150 years of economic theory.
Yes, I do, sir.
That's rather presumptuous, don't you think?
It is, sir.
Well, Mr. Nash, with a breakthrough of this magnitude, I'm confident you will get any placement you like.
Are we live? Okay. So one of the points about that to me is that here's this brainy guy who's made this fantastic discovery that says that we have to revamp the way our culture works, because our culture, I mean, I don't know what you were taught here, but in the United States you're taught very clearly that, you know, this is the basis of our culture, is this capitalism, and that by people competing and going into business that you provide for other people, even though it looks selfish from one standpoint, it's not, because in the end everybody gains. But now in 2018 we can see that that isn't necessarily so, because we're in a place where a lot of our natural resources are gone. We've got major extinction events going on with species, and so we can't operate. I mean, we can operate. That's what the politicians are doing to us. They're just keeping on as if everything's the same, and they're still teaching business as though that's the case. And the only things I see that are changing that is from the level of, well, I see, for example, the co-opetition that was over here at the high school students making the robots. And they didn't call it a competition, they called it co-opetition. So if somebody's robot broke, the other teams would come to that aid, which you wouldn't do in regular competition.
Well, I think in that brief excerpt that we saw from A Beautiful Mind, what's powerful is that Nash seemed to have found a way of confirming the power and usefulness of individual creativity and entrepreneurialism, but marrying it to the common good. He said the best way we do best when we take care of ourselves and the group. And this seems to be so obvious to me. It seems to be like a return to primitive communism in a way, where, you know, you had your role within the village, but the village took care of you and you took care of the village. So it seems to me what's unique about that is that he managed to do it in the language of economics and mathematics. And so to prove that really social idea in mathematics, to me, is very powerful. And the other thing that inspired me about this little clip is the power of passion. Clearly, the blonde was someone who was extremely powerful in her magnetic aura, and it created a wave of inspiration in Nash that allowed him to come up with his his theories. So my contention is that we have to embrace passion and learn how to channel it correctly and not to dismiss it. So he was the only one who ran up to the blonde and thanked her, because suddenly he was filled with a great creativity that followed the passion. So I rather like that message too.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you appreciate it. It really got me when I remember watching that movie, and that scene just stuck in my mind. And I didn't even have to excerpt it. I just looked it up on YouTube, and somebody had already pulled out and assembled all those scenes, because they're not exactly contiguous. So the person who did that has done a good job.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that from the time period, I think it looks like the 50s or 60s, and here we have evidence yet again that ideas that were focused on the harmony of all and the well-being of all, without squashing individualism or entrepreneurialism, were at the forefront. And I'm a little more cynical in terms of the change. I see that we're aware of the change, but there are very powerful interests that delay us doing the necessary. If you take a look at 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring with regards to pesticides and the disappearance of birds, well, we're still heavily polluting our environment. We're still using petroleum agriculture as the basis of our industrial agricultural model. And prior to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1952, Kornbluth and Pohl published The Space Merchants, which imagined a world in which the advertising agencies ran everything, and their only opposition was the Consies, and Consies stands for conservationists. So there you have in 1952 the idea that conservationists would rise as the opposition to a world that is endlessly revolving around consumption, 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 consumption. So we have it portrayed in 1952 in a real revolutionary piece of science fiction, The Space Merchants by C.M. Kornbluth and Frederick Pohl.
I'd like to read that. That sounds fascinating. There's so much that in literature that is precognizant, if that's the right word, of what's going on. And I understand that it takes a long time for these things to trickle through, but we are seeing it. And the one example I was mentioning was the cooperation, the robotics, but there are others ones too. There was one I brought up on our Citizens Forum show about hedge funds. The president of a major hedge fund wrote a letter to the major corporations of the United States that he invests in, and these are multinational corporations too, so they're not just U.S. based. But he just said it's no longer that bottom line thing that the corporation is in business to make to increase the value for the shareholders is no longer good enough for him to want to invest in your company. You have to have some kind of social benefit. Now, it may be that his idea as choosing his investments, I mean, for example, I don't know if he would choose Deutsche Bank's recommendation of buying U.S. private prison companies as a growth industry. I mean, that kind of...
It is a growth industry.
I'm just putting that in my... I mean, I don't have a retirement account anymore, but putting that in my retirement account would cause me heart pains, I can tell you that. I just would have a really hard time with that. So anyway, we'll have to see how that actually plays out, but still it's a good sign to me that things are changing. And the other thing that I wanted to, this sort of folds into the next piece that I wanted to show, is that there are all sorts of different ways, and I want to spend several shows on these different ways that people are experiencing transformation. And one of the ways that I know a lot of people who have done ayahuasca or LSD or other entheogens, I think that's the right term, and that gives you an insight into our connectedness, evidently, and all sorts of other things about how the planet works that we don't get if we just look at it from a scientific point of view. But there are other things too. There are people who are getting abducted by ETs, and I read a book I'd like to cover. In fact, I may be able to interview the author. I just made friends with him on Facebook. But he's written a book called, his name's Jeremy Viney, and he's written a book called "I Know Why the Aliens Don't Land," or I know why the flying saucers don't land, or something like that. But it's because it's not really it's a function of consciousness, and I think Jacques Vallée says this too, or maybe even Carl Jung, that these flying saucers are they're not really material in the way that we're used to things being material. They're more of a function of consciousness. But the net result of the people who get abducted by ETs is that they become much more Earth-centered. They become aware of their connection, that they're a part of Earth, and that they want to take care of the Earth. And then the last group is the near-death experiencers, and they experience the same type of thing. This woman that I'll bring up, I didn't put this part in for, but she experienced the Earth as a sentient, as an entity, but then the thing I just wanted to show you on this very short excerpt is that she was a person who was chronically sick, and they didn't know what was wrong with her, and but she spent a lot of time being very sick. And then she had this experience, this near-death experience, and when she came out of it, her husband wanted to take her to the hospital, but she just knew she didn't need that anymore. So I want you to just notice the emotion and the certainty that this person exhibits, and this is something that
we're ready to watch the clip?
Yeah, we watch the clip. This is
by the way, right after my experience, my husband was kind of, freaking out, like, do I call 911? What do we need to do? What's happening? And I was totally adamant. There's no way you're calling anyone. I'm not going to a doctor. I don't need to ask a doctor if I'm okay. I was totally sure that I was okay. I was more okay than ever. So there's no way that I was going to let him call a doctor or anyone.
So my point about this particular clip is just that once you go through this experience when your consciousness is changed, so that you know that there is some other layer that we as humans with our consciousness have access to some kind of it's a realm where consciousness has control over reality, and a person can be instantly healed. These people who experience it, you could not talk that person out of that conviction. And I think that that's a really important thing, because it only takes about 10% of a population to where the behavior changes. And we could find some Rupert Sheldrake clips about morphic fields, about how we don't really talk about this, but we are all a part of our behavioral morphic field as humans. And if 10%, if it only takes 10% of people to really get that we need to change our behavior because we're part of the Earth, not separate from the Earth, but then we have to take care of her. We can't. Right. I think that we could have a real sea change in the way the planet runs in a very short amount of time. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I can say that this is going to happen for sure, but I've just gone from seeing no possibility for any kind of redemption for the planet. Just get ready to die, get some dried food, last as long as you can, but maybe the best thing is just to check out now, to seeing, well, something else is going to happen. Do you want to comment on that? Or?
Well, there's a lot that you've said that I'd like to comment upon, as I never like to lose an opportunity to pontificate, but I think the first comment was that the common thread in what you mentioned with regards to entheogens or spirit plant medicines and near-death experiences and quote-unquote alien abductions is that people enter into an altered state of consciousness. And in that altered state of consciousness, different information, different material is presented to the individual in that state of high receptivity and amazing brain connectivity that happens, as we know from studying entheogens under scientific modalities, the brain just connects with every part of the brain, and some parts are excluded and other parts are massively connected that aren't typically connected. So we have synesthetic experiences where we see color, or we hear color, or we see music, etc. And these our senses blend, and we have different ways of accessing information. And the task of the person who experiences an altered state of consciousness is to bring this information back to consensus reality consciousness when she or he returns, and then take that forward. And invariably what happens is, you're quite correct, is that people who undergo that experience start to feel a deep connection with others, with nature, with Mother Earth, with Spirit, and somehow that altered state of consciousness going into that realm allows one to access that probably inherent fiber of compassion and connectedness that allows us to move forward. And I think that that's happening in increasing ways, as perhaps Gaia herself sends out messages through her plants, that we need to spread these ideas of compassion and connectedness, and the fundamental unity, and that the duality, the separateness, is only so that you can enjoy the separateness and marvel at the uniqueness of each individual separate being, which really is, from a quantum physics point of view and from a spiritual point of view, all one. So I think that's really significant in what you said, the common thread being altered states of consciousness, taking information back, and that this is transformative. I find it amazing that a person can have a near-death experience and come out physically and emotionally healed. I'm too skeptical within myself to imagine that happening for me. But I accept that it happens for others. I've met people who have been to Yuwipi healing ceremonies and have had heart repair and other miraculous things, and we know from just modern, let's say, TV shows that miracles are constantly happening in the medical realm. Constantly happening. 1 or 2% of patients are miraculous recoveries that the doctors can't explain, and some doctors rail against that because it offends their scientific sensibilities, and others have a big enough heart to say, okay, this is groovy, wow, and so I can't explain why these healings come about, but that to me is like saying, yes, this really happened. You're proof. You're proof that the altered state of consciousness that you've been gifted with really happened, and the proof is that physically you're healed.
Yes.
So I find it hard to accept for myself, but in others it seems to be easier for me to accept that that's possible.
Well, for one thing, we're at this point where to go back to the world is flat, the world is round thing. When people started, when the first realization that the world is round came about, how many people said, that can't possibly be, how can the world be a ball? What is it sitting on? I mean, there are all these things that your brain has going on but eventually you can see that, well, it does make sense. So it takes a while for us to really integrate that. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing. And I'd like to mention one other book that I read that just popped into my mind when you were talking. It's a book called Sex at Dawn. And I don't know if you've read that, but it's basically going back to the transition time when humans went from being hunter-gatherers to agricultural and living in cities. And this was a relatively short amount of time that this happened. And reading that book, the book deals with sexuality, and so it was saying we had a culture when we were hunter-gatherers where it was sort of, I think they use the term, no, it's another book that uses the term monogamish, but it's a term where it was basically a sort of a much looser sexual social organization than we have now. And then it was when we became settled in cities that we have this type of thing where the patriarchal ownership, the marriage is I own the woman, and this really it really flipped my thinking on a lot of things, including economics, because I was looking when you're young, you're taught that these things are true, and so I think one of the things that I thought that was that economics there was some kind of a system that worked, and there was a really good system, and we just had to somehow find what that was and optimize our system, and everything would be wonderful and work. And I've come to the conclusion now that we just sort of walk into whatever system is on the planet and have to deal with it. And so it's like you say, you get up in the morning, you experience things. You just say, I'm going to experience this. And so I really became much more able to enjoy my own life because I didn't have to fix anything anymore. I just had to accept that this is the way it is, whether this is how marriage works, this is how economics works, that's just how it is right now. But as a matter of fact, and we have stories about that, so whether you think that some really smart guy like a Bill Gates hunter-gatherer came around and said, hey, let's plant the seeds and let's, and created this new system, or whether you have a story that, what's his name, Demeter came down and taught people how to do. I don't care about that so much. I don't care about how it actually happened. What I care about is that there was a short period of time when humans went through this huge culture shift. Because I think that's really what we're facing now, is a huge culture shift. And I think for us to say, well, that's impossible, you couldn't possibly fix all the things that are wrong right now. I'm pretty optimistic that actually we could, because if consciousness is primary, then somehow we're going to figure this out, and it may take a big breakdown first, but then when we come back up, it can be totally different, and it can happen relatively quickly. It's not an event. It's a process, but it can go in a rapid manner.
What to say about that? I think I'm a little more romantic and squeamish, in the sense that the romance comes in the idea that what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason. And if we apply that principle, we could imagine a way out of the destructive dilemma that we're in. But I'm squeamish in the sense that I really don't want to see millions and billions of people having to be culled in order for us to get it right. But I'm realistic too, and I would say that within human history there's always been this struggle between the ego-driven, narcissistic, individualistic, psychopathic, sociopathic model, Hobbes's nature read in tooth and claw, versus the many examples we have in nature of deep, fundamental, structural cooperation, without which life itself would be impossible. We talked about this the other time, how 3 or 4 pounds of me is bugs, microbes, without which I could not be. So we've had a tendency under patriarchy to worship the domination model in nature of the predator on the prey, as opposed to the fundamentally cooperative nature of even that relationship of predator and prey, and not looking at the nature that we've emerged from in terms of its many cooperative elements, and rather in order to strengthen the patriarchy and establish dominance structures and power structures, we've looked at only one aspect of nature and taken that as our true nature. Where I think we're kind of blended, and I see those echoes in cooperative, social, democratic, economic models, and versus hardcore capitalist models, which were existent at the turn of the 20th century and which have returned at the turn of the 21st. You know, maybe the dissolution of the Soviet Empire had something to do with that, with this wild outbreak of gangster capitalism in the Soviet bloc, gave new impetus to, you know, what Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were trying to reinvent in neoliberalism, and you know, the worship of Adam Smith's "The Market is Always Right," the invisible hand of the market, and Ayn Rand, and this fellow that you were mentioning in one of your posts, Ludwig von Mises. I found that an interesting quote, and I'm interested in how your understanding of economics has changed in terms of how we as a human society can move forward.
Well, I have to tell you, that's changing daily. I'm not involved in the markets. I traded the markets for many years. My father was a stockbroker, and I learned from him. I apprenticed with him, and then I became a gold trader and foreign currency trader. So I did that for probably a total of 10 or 15 years of my life. And I think I had a system that was based on free enterprise, and that the market was, as you say, the market is right. The market sort of finds an equilibrium, and I've just changed now to where I just think that all this particular system is fairly arbitrary, and I mean I can delve more deeply into that, but I would say just to give you something to chew on, to think about. We're taught in our Christian culture that the love of money is evil. So money itself isn't evil, but the love of money is evil. Okay, so money is one of those functional things that you have to have, and if you can't let yourself fall too much in love with it. But going back to, I had to take this apart in my own thinking. I had to go back to the definition of money, which money has three attributes you're taught in economics. It's a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. So our money, there is no more money. What that's saying is there is no more money because there's nothing that's a store of value. It's just a token. So in the case of something like our standard currency, it started out as we used coins. We used coins that were a store of value. They're gold or silver. The coins that were used in Roman or Greek times or any of those older civilizations are still worth what they were worth because they have a content of gold or silver. And then we moved to warehouse receipts, so it was just a deposit receipt saying somewhere this was on deposit, and now it's just a declaration, this is money. But it's also the thing that the characteristic is that it's all around interest. So I would say that interest is the love of money. I would say that is the formulaic expression of the love of money, because as David Rockefeller once said, when somebody asked him how much money is enough, he said just a little bit more. And that's really what interest is saying. I want a little bit more. But if you think about that philosophically, if you have a cow and you trade it to me for gold, and somebody says I want a little interest on that, you're taken away from something. There's something that, and what we're seeing now, the result of that is we're taking away from the planet. I think so. But I wanted to go back also to mentioning that you were talking about how see, I used to worry about things. I mean, you're told that by being a trader, you're helping the market work. So even though you're a speculator and you're trying to, I mean, if you're long rice, if you own rice, you're all for the maggots eating the rice because you want the price to go up. And the thing is that, well, that's okay because there's somebody else that, you know, doesn't want the maggots to eat the rice. And by engaging in this market, we're making sure that everybody gets the lowest price possible. And that started to fall away for me with the cannabis situation, because I realized that in the United States, before this started moving towards legalization, it was totally illegal everywhere. Cannabis was completely illegal, and yet the volume, it was hard to estimate, but the amount of cannabis that was bought and sold, traded in the United States was more than the two main crops, which are corn and wheat, I think. So the total volume of commodities of corn and wheat was less than the dollar volume of cannabis. And yet cannabis has no futures exchange, has no marketing, it has no transportation system. This is all informal, and yet it worked very well. I mean, it worked since it was...
It certainly met demand.
It met demand. And now that was a very interesting thing for me, because it says, now wait a minute, a lot of this stuff that we're doing really isn't necessary, and especially now that we have all these computers. I don't know if you were watching how the big financial companies are using computers, but essentially they skim a little bit off of each transaction, and they'll do front running on stock. If you want to buy a stock, they might make get a little money off that. So I mean, the whole thing it's gone way beyond anything that's reasonable or fair, and so I can't believe in that system anymore the way I believed in it when I was actively involved in doing that for making a living. I couldn't do that anymore and feel good about myself. So just wanted to mention that's so I'm whatever happens.
And how would you relate this question of money and finances and capitalism to this larger question of we're all going to die, we're all going to live?
Oh no, I didn't explain it very well. Sometimes you have to get me to connect the dots, but I just think that the nature of that system of fiat currency, of whether it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's dollars or it all works the same way, but there's never going to be enough to fulfill the need, and so there's always going to be misallocation. You're never going to be in a position where you just want to share things.
So this comes back to almost like a psychological framework where endless growth is really another way of saying we live in scarcity and we must create more and more,
exactly.
More because there's not enough for us and we need more and more and more and more and more. So we come from a sense of scarcity when the universe is endlessly abundant, as we're told by many people, and that there is no scarcity. The Chinese communists had a different way of saying it. There wasn't a problem with production, but rather a problem with distribution.
Right.
And certainly that is true today. If you take a look at how federal funds are distributed in Canada, or funds in general from both levels of government are distributed in Canada for education, First Nations, under the responsibility of the federal government, are receiving 30% less per student than non-Aboriginal Canadians. So there's a question of distribution. If the distribution was fair, would there be a slight lowering of the average in Canada, or would there be a dramatic increase when First Nations finally got their fair share and stopped subsidizing the colonial settler state? So distribution to me seems to be a real crucial question of social solidarity and that connectedness that we feel, that I think is re-emerging in the planet.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I watched a video, I can't remember, I've watched so many videos lately to think about how we're going to do this that I should write them all down, but I don't. But anyway, this person was just saying, there's enough food thrown away in the United States every day to feed everybody on the planet. So that's keys right in with what you're saying. It could be, if it were distributed.
Yeah, I think the crucial challenge is how do we downsize in a way that allows me to retain my romantic notions and not have my squeamishness insulted. How do we downsize this continual growth model such that we increase the effectiveness of the distribution and we slowly but surely reduce human impact on the planet? It's a huge task, and I really don't see any level of government handling this on a planetary scale. I see a few individual governments doing a lot of smart things to prepare. You can take the the example of tiny Bhutan, which has a plan to increase its forest cover from 65% of the land to 75% of the land, because that will increase the gross national happiness of the people and the countryside and all the other life forms that enjoy the forest and provide an economically sustainable fundamental platform for the development of the country. How can we all become Bhutan?
Well, that's the good question, isn't it? But we're both on the same page. I mean, we're coming at it from different angles, and we've seen different things, so it's not surprising. For example, one of the most exciting things to me that's going on is the idea of these KIMS domains in Russia. And there was a shamanic. That's another story we can go into at some other point. In fact, I'd like to have some people to talk to about this set of books called Anastasia books. But the idea that what she proposed back in the 90s is that eventually each family can have a hectare, which is 2.5 acres of land, and they can build a kin domain, which is a sustainable sort of like a permaculture type of installation where everybody lives and works. And this is happening now. Putin, in I think it was 2015 or 2016, signed into law, and there are already tens of thousands of people who are creating these things, and it's over in eastern Russia. But I see that as really catching on. And in that case, you see people who say, well, I can't do anything about what Canada is doing, building pipelines or anything else, but what I can do is I and my family can take care of this plot of land. And we can make it, we can keep Roundup off it, we can keep all this other bad stuff off of it, and we can take care of the earth. And that is a symbiotic relationship with the earth. It's acknowledging the role of DNA, the interplay of DNA, which we don't do in our factory farm environment. So there are a number of things that are showing us that this is possible, and it always happens with a small number of people first, in some place like Bhutan and Russia, and that just isn't here yet. It isn't in our. We haven't gotten to that point yet.
Yeah, I read recently on Facebook, so who knows if it's true, but roughly 3.5% of the population adopt an idea, then it has a tendency to spread very rapidly and start to influence change. So
exactly, that's what I was talking about, the tipping point.
And there are some cycles. A lot of the more spiritual connectedness, hippie values that are re-emerging now. I mean, these were happening in the 60s and 70s with quite a fervor, and then they died down and they were repressed. Maybe in conjunction with the transit of the outer planets, who knows? There are some theories with regards to that, but here again we see an efflorescence of these ideas of connectedness, spiritual connectedness, and looking for some deeper relationship to the all. I like the stuff that I've been exposed to with regards to Anastasia. It's a little bit Slavic in its thrust, but that's okay because she was Russian, and so why wouldn't it be? But I like the fact that people are encouraged to practice permaculture and have a permanent relationship with a little piece of the earth, and develop that spiritual relationship with that piece of earth, and have a sense of protection and gratitude. You protect that piece of land, and you express your gratitude for that piece of land. You cherish it, and it's in that love relationship that you get great tomatoes. You know.
And there again, we have the archaic revival, because we have a relationship with each other and with plants. I mean, we're not going to work the way we are in our society. We're living together, more like an eco-village or something.
Yeah, I mean, if I wax science fictional, I mean, I see absolutely amazing potential for real work to be done, and that's to say, I don't have any fear of robots or mechanization or tools coming to to the service of humans. I'm not worried at all about humans being replaced. What I see is tremendous opportunity, especially with a realignment of our education system, for people to be free from drudgery and to spend their time being rock stars and painters and philosophers and healers and spiritual questers and furniture makers and people who are in touch with their hearts. And I foresee an age called the Anthropocene II, in which we spend about several thousand years repairing the tremendous damage that this exponential explosion of humans has wrought upon the planet. And to rein ourselves in and then be real stewards in many ways, just like whales are stewards of the ocean. We know from their activity that they churn up tremendous amounts of biomass, bring the phytoplankton up to the surface, create opportunities for more plant and animal life in the ocean, and that they create as much turbulence in the waves as the wind does.
Wow.
Whales, so they're the stewards of the ocean. We need to be stewards of the land in that same unconscious, natural way that whales are to the ocean, right? So that's really something for us to work towards as we heal the planet. So in my science fictional mind, I see some tough times, and then kind of a spiritual ethos where we restore the planet in everything we do, and we have reverence for all forms of life.
So one of the things that I want to do on this show is I want to, instead of, we have a tendency on these shows to look for horrible things.
I love horrible things.
Well, I'm getting tired of it. I told Carolyn that, you know, the show, I'm okay with showing people bad things, kind of like the way I'll hold your hair while you vomit, you know.
Right.
And then let's move on.
Yeah, and as we talked about previously, is that the purpose of being exposed to the ugly is not to run away from the ugly or to reject it, but to see it for what it is and ask yourself, what can I do? What's the healing in me that needs to come out?
Right.
What can I do in my little piece, within my own body, within my own family, within my own community? You don't have to be John F. Kennedy, you don't have to be Gorbachev, you just have to be you. But really be you, feel the pain, and then do something good.
Yeah, open your heart. I saw another video, another fellow that I want to have on the show, I think his name's Jeremy, and he was talking about how all the problems, if you think about it, on the planet, can be attributed to a lack of consciousness. Everybody does everything out of love, but it's just the love that they're able to express is very limited. So a soldier who goes over and fights is not doing it because he wants to kill that guy. He's doing it because he loves his country, or he loves his family, or at least he's been talked into that. But his consciousness of love is very limited because he can't see that he's connected to that other person, and that that this doesn't really solve any problems to kill this person.
Well, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that person doesn't recognize the connectedness when you have Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself, and you have Marx saying, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. So in both instances, both Jesus and Marx were calling upon a fundamental unity that is in people, and that basically Marx was pissed off about the chains, so he was a little more aggressive in his language, but basically the intent is the same, to love and respect, and from each according to his need, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I find that these are really spiritual sayings, and yet there are people very well organized. My point was that for generations and millennia we've known what is the right way to behave. Wise people have told us, you know, the Taoists,
oh yeah, you mean that's
the
yeah.
spiritual teachers, the messengers, the groups of people, the tribes that have lived in harmony. We've had many examples of how we can do this and many instructions, and yet there's always a fundamental sort of base of power that is opposed to this, and I see that still rooted in the patriarchy and its child, its bastard child, capitalism, and its mature evil child, corporate capitalism.
Well, another really hopeful one a situation I was looking at was a fellow in South Africa named Michael Tellinger, and he was saying that nobody should have to work more than a couple days a week, that we just have, you know, a bad distribution system, and I think his party's called the Ubuntu Party.
Right, okay. Now, I recall as a child when I was, 10, 11, 12, reading in the popular press that the way industrialization was going, that we wouldn't have to work more than about 30 hours a week. And that was the projection at that time, 50, 60 years ago. Well, I can tell you that in the last 2 years before I retired, the volume of work that I performed increased by about 10% as the hospital reconfigured. And if I speak to my former colleagues today, well, their workload has increased by another 10% above what it was when I retired. So it just doesn't make sense that we've had this promise of less work and we're all working frantically. And in some ways, I see that that's a tremendous success of the structures within capitalism that urge us to endlessly consume.
Yes.
If you've got to have all these toys, well, then you've got to pay the piper, and your nose is held to the grindstone for longer and longer. We know from actuarial studies that the longer you work, the quicker you die.
Right.
So it's no accident that government is inclined to extend the age before which you can receive your pension, because the longer you work, the sooner you die, the less pension they have to pay for you, the more money they can put into social programs or weapons or whatever they decide they're going to do.
I've thought about this question, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think part of the answer is just the way we're taught that, in the United States you're taught that it's a virtue to make money, and it's a virtue to be a capitalist and to start a business, to be an entrepreneur. But another thing that impressed me about this is kind of an arbitrary thing is before I moved to Costa Rica in 1998, before going there I visited, and I happened to watch a TV program when I was in the hotel, and they had the results of a poll. They had taken a poll of Costa Ricans saying, "Are you happy with your life? Are you content?" And the answer was 90% of people were happy with their lives. And this despite the fact that a person with a college degree was making about $500 a month. That was a good salary. So from my point of view of starting a business, that sounded great. I'm going to have happy employees that I don't have to pay more than $500 a month. But I went back to the United States before I moved down there, and I saw just about the exact same poll synchronistically on TV, and it was astonishing because only about 30% of Americans were happy, and they were working harder. They thought that if they worked harder, they would be happier. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Isn't that just amazing? I still don't know, even though I lived in Costa Rica for 5 years, I don't really know exactly why that's so.
Right. It is a little bit hard to understand because you can definitely point to a time in American history when workers' rights were certainly being encouraged and protected, the 30s in particular, and after the war, lots of unions that were really doing well, but in the greed model and in the scarcity model, which requires the uber capitalists to get into this paranoia that they don't have enough, you've got to do away with any other power center that might squirrel away some of the resources that you want to acquire for yourself. So unions are broken down, and all of the progressive social solidarity structures that were built in America have slowly but surely been chopped away by Democrats as well as Republicans. Let's recall that in the 50s, the Republicans were talking about national health care in the United States. And,
yes.
And yet you have Democrats of the ilk of Tony Blair in England who have completely and utterly embraced capitalism and put social solidarity to the side time and again. Certainly Clinton was guilty of this. So,
yes.
You know.
Well, I'm not saying that I can see the light at the end of the tunnel yet, but I see the tunnel, and and I really do think that we can, by talking about these things, we can sort of separate the things that we really don't want to look at that much, and focus on some of the things that are more important for creating this new world that we're all going to be experiencing at some point. I don't know whether we're I can't say yet. I understand your uncomfortableness with the mass die-off and things like that, but I have no way of knowing what's going to happen there. Mm-hmm. But still, I think it's worth focusing on what people are doing who are trying to make a good difference in our culture. So
I think there is a process that we recognize that on the one hand there's this dismantlement, and in that regard Trump and his coterie of supporters are providing us an excellent example of what I call the great dismantlement. And on the other hand, there's a great turning away from the petroleum economy and towards permaculture, or return to the archaic revival, return to permaculture, a return to the value of human labor, a return to connectedness. And so there's these two processes that are going on, and really every human has to make up her mind. Mm-hmm. Which side am I on? There's no standing by the wayside and saying,
no, there's no middle ground. You've got to make a choice. Well, I think we've established a number of, we've done a little bit more work on sort of parsing this, seeing where we're going to go, and plus sort of, since we don't know each other really well, but still seeing that this is a good conversation, that we both have different points of view, or at least we're coming at this from different life experiences, which I hope this is interesting for our viewers. And I'd just like to, unless you want to say something else, I'd just like to thank all of everybody who's watching, whether they're watching live or watching the recorded version of this. Thank you for watching In Victoria's Garden. I'm Will Smith and Dr.
I'd like to thank Ben, who assisted us with the technical matters today, and also it's great to find this little venue here on Yates that's provided us with that opportunity.
You can't tell where it is.
Okay, and I can't tell where it is. In fact, I'm blindfolded.
So, thanks for watching In Victoria's Garden, and then you just cut to that.
You'll have to edit that out, I guess.